It can be tough to identify as a Zionist these days.
We don't want no Zionists here! Raise your hand if you're a Zionist! This is your chance to get out!
But are you ready for a hot take? I'm willing to bet that some of the folks on that subway were Zionists, even if they didn't know it. Because Zionism is simply the belief that Jews have a right to govern themselves in their ancestral homeland. Anti-Zionism is the belief that, well, we don't. Bad news for the anti-Zionist crowd, though. The Zionist dream has already come true. We do have self-determination in our ancestral homeland. It's called the modern state of Israel. So if we have our own country, do we still need Zionism? You might have heard that Judaism isn't Zionism. After all, you don't need to be Jewish to be a Zionist. There are more Christian Zionists in the United States than there are Jews in the entire world. But let me blow your mind for a second. Judaism is inherently Zionist. I can already see you rolling your eyes. Zionism is a modern concept. The word Zionism wasn't invented until 1890. That's technically true. Zionism as a modern political movement began in the late 1800s. But the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, that's 4,000 years old. The foundational text of our religion is the Hebrew Bible. From the very first book, Israel is presented as the promised land, and the rest is history. For centuries, we lived and ruled and squabbled with each other in this land. Sometimes our kings paid tribute to foreign empires, other times we were fully independent. But no matter who was in charge, one thing was constant. Our land was our home. And then the Babylonians came along. They destroyed our capital and hauled us off to captivity. But instead of disappearing, we survived. Thousands of years later, we're still singing the songs we wrote in that long ago exile, dreaming of our return to Zion. And that dream came true. We did return to Zion, where we reestablished our kingdom. But Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel came to an end when the Roman Empire destroyed our communities, enslaved our people, and sent us into exile once more. A handful of Jews remained in the land of Israel. The rest of us scattered, ending up anywhere from Iraq to Poland to the Caribbean. But no matter where we were in the world, one thing remained constant. 3 times a day, we turned towards Jerusalem and begged God to return us to Zion. We ended each Passover Seder with cries of "Next year in Jerusalem." Every summer, we observed the solemn holiday of Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of our home. And even in moments of joy and celebration, we made a point of remembering our greatest loss. Ever wonder why Jewish weddings end with the smashing of a glass? Now you know. It's a symbol of the destruction of Jerusalem thousands of years ago. For 1900 years, we prayed and longed and remembered. And over the centuries, a slow trickle of Jewish refugees, mystics, and pilgrims made their way back home. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, that trickle became a flood. Nationalism was sweeping the globe. Ordinary people living under great empires dreamed of self-rule. And Jews, who had survived 2 millennia of persecution in foreign lands, began to think of Jerusalem as more than just a metaphor or distant religious concept. It was a real place, only a boat ride away. Okay, but why now? The Jews had 2,000 years to turn that trickle to a flood, right? See, the final years of the 19th century were a particularly bad time for Jews in Europe. Across the Russian Empire, violence and oppression soared. The Jews were tired of pogroms and anti-Semitic laws, and though they couldn't know what shape it would take, some predicted a catastrophe was coming. Even so-called enlightened societies like France seemed unable to rid themselves of their ingrained hatred of Jews. In 1894, a decorated French army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was framed for treason, publicly humiliated, and deported to Devil's Island. But there was no evidence for the crime. In fact, it turned out that the French army's high command had known he was innocent. But the mistake was embarrassing for them. So they left him in prison. They believed that no one would look too closely at this case. After all, Dreyfus was a Jew. The generals had good reason to think that way. The country that had once championed liberté, égalité, et fraternité was convulsing with anti-Semitic riots. But some people were looking closely, including a Viennese journalist who had been sent to France to cover the riots. What he saw made him realize that anti-Semitism was a disease that couldn't be cured. That journalist's name was Theodor Herzl. Like Dreyfus, Herzl was an assimilated Jew. He'd done his best to blend in, to embrace every part of society open to him. But now, he found himself gripped by despair. What hope did the Jewish people have if even the most assimilated, high-ranking Jew could be brought so low on so little evidence? Pogroms were driving Jews out of Eastern Europe in the millions. Anti-Semitism had infected the highest levels of society in the supposedly enlightened West. What kind of future did that leave for Europe's Jews? I sat down with Chaviv Retegur, a senior analyst for the Times of Israel, to talk through some of his ideas.
The Zionist predictive power is astonishing. When Zionism forms its institutions and gives its warnings, Herzl writes about a catastrophe that's coming and says they're going to come for us. He literally uses those words. And he's talking about mass killings, among other things, and expulsions and theft and expropriation. They talk 50 years ahead of time about what's going to happen, and all of it plays out just like they predicted, because they was rooted in a real understanding of the sociology of the time.
Herzl decided there was no point in fighting anti-Semitism. If the Jews wanted a life free of persecution, they'd have to build it elsewhere, away from people who hated them.
Zionism comes in and says the danger is not old anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism. The danger is so much bigger. And if we don't get out, we face a catastrophe.
Like other nations, they'd need their own state. They would need to become Zionists, people who believed that the Jewish people had a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. Though, of course, it wasn't quite that easy. It wouldn't be a Jewish story without an argument, and these early Zionists loved to argue. Sure, they agreed on the basic premise, but what would self-determination look like? What should their homeland be? There were as many answers as there were Zionists, but 6 common themes emerged in these endless debates. 6 types of Zionism, which sometimes overlapped and sometimes contradicted each other. 6 Zionisms, which still exist today. For political Zionists, the answer was simple. The Jewish state should look like all other states. It was the Jewish people's lack of a state that was at the root of all anti-Semitism. Once they had a state, poof, they'd be just like everyone else, and anti-Semitism would disappear.
Wouldn't that be nice?
For labor Zionists, the Jewish state would be better than all others. Its economy would focus on agriculture in a nod to the Jewish people's roots as simple farmers in their homeland. This time, though, they'd ditch the religious monarchy in favor of a fully secular, socialist government, for the people, by the people. Cultural Zionists, on the other hand, dreamed of building a cultural and spiritual hub for Jewish peoplehood, where the Jewish soul would flourish. The Jews would read and write and sing in Hebrew. They'd create art with Jewish themes, hold conversations about Jewish topics, and regenerate Jewish culture. They didn't even need to govern themselves. They just wanted a Jewish cultural renaissance in the place where the Jewish people were born. Meanwhile, revisionist Zionists dreamed of a big, bold Jewish state within the borders of biblical Israel. Revisionist Zionists weren't necessarily religious, but they were extremely proud of their Jewish identity. They idolized the Jewish warriors of the Bible and of history.
When the other Zionist factions are saying maybe it can be an autonomy, maybe it can be something linked to some larger state, the revisionists say, guys, the only way we survive this thing is if we have complete self-determination and self-reliance and our own army and our own borders and our own state. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
A jüdische Meluche mit den beiden wichtigsten Simonim von der Meluche, das heißt, jeden sollen sein die Mehrheit und jeden sollen halten in seiner Hand die Verwaltung vom Land.
They knew there was a fight ahead, and they were prepared for it. Religious Zionists believed the revival of the Jewish homeland was a religious obligation. Their Zionism was the closest in nature to the Zionism that Jews had been espousing for thousands of years. They believed that the Jewish return to Zion was a sign that Judaism's promised redemption was close at hand. God was sending them a message. They just had to listen. And because every thesis has an antithesis, the religious Zionists had a diametric opposite. These were equally religious Jews who studied the same texts and said the same prayers, who were also waiting for the Messiah and the ultimate redemption. They just disagreed completely on who would make it happen. These were the religious non-Zionists, who believed that Jews had no business trying to establish a secular state in the Holy Land. Only God could decide when it was time for his children to return home. And they believed that God wasn't too happy about his children building a secular state with public transit on Shabbat and girls in shorts. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear. Jews who object to Zionism on religious grounds also long for a return to Zion, for the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, for the establishment of a religious monarchy in the Holy Land. They also end their seders with "next year in Jerusalem" and their weddings with the smashing of a glass. Even they believe that Israel is the Jewish homeland, promised to us by God. There were other types of Zionism too. The movement was as messy and complicated and multidimensional as Jews themselves. It was everything, everywhere, all at once. But as all these figures bickered and negotiated and did their best to build their own utopias, shadows were gathering. Anti-Semitic laws were common in Europe, but when the Nazis came to power, those laws became more and more severe. And as country after country fell to the Nazi assault, they too began instituting strict anti-Jewish laws. Jews were no longer allowed to go to school, or to work, or to public parks. Ordinary people stood by and watched as Jewish shops and synagogues were smashed and burned, as Jews were beaten in the street, as they were crowded into ghettos, as they were deported to the East. The lucky ones got out as soon as they could, but most weren't lucky. By 1946, a third of the world's Jews were gone, and all those ideological Zionisms, the competing visions of the perfect Jewish state, they were gone too. Or at least, they were secondary now to the only Zionism that really mattered, the one that would save the world's remaining Jews from annihilation. First, they'd focus on surviving. Then they could argue about the specifics. Because it wouldn't matter if the new state was secular or religious, if its language was Hebrew or Yiddish or Ladino. It wouldn't matter if there were no more Jews left to live in it. They argued and they negotiated and they compromised. But in the end, they just did it. The labor Zionists and the revisionists, the cultural Zionists and the religious did everything they could to build a Jewish state. And though the non-Zionists were frustrated and opposed to the whole project, they understood that this was happening. It was useless to interfere. And more than 70 years later, here we are. This isn't the state that any of the early Zionists envisioned, but I think every Zionist leader would recognize elements of their vision in this messy, multicultural, miraculous state that exists today. Herzl understood how dangerous anti-Semitism would be for Jews, but even he, that prophet of catastrophe, was too optimistic about Zionism's powers.
What was the lived experience of millions of people who became Zionists in the 20th century? It was essentially the emptying out of entire continents. They couldn't live anywhere else. If you're an Israeli Jew and you look out at the Eastern Hemisphere, all the other Jews are dead. Your grandparents are refugees. No other option for survival was open to them. America's doors closed in 1921. All the rest of the Jews of the world become Israeli, or the Jews of Europe and the Arab world become Israeli.
Anti-Semitism wasn't rooted in our lack of a state. In fact, our state has become a convenient target for those same old Jew haters, even providing cover for those who claim they are merely anti-Zionists, not anti-Semites.
I want Israel to be dismantled.
Anti-Zionism is the argument that they shouldn't have survived the 20th century. That sure feels anti-Semitic to the Jew who you're saying it to. Anti-Zionism need not be anti-Semitism, unless it's willfully ignorant on purpose because it is virtue signaling about the very survival of an entire human community.
In Europe, rioters had screamed, "Go to Palestine," often with an anti-Jewish slur added in for good measure. In Israel, we watch reports of protesters demanding we go back to Europe.
Back to Europe, where you're originally from!
They killed us there too!
Go back to the mass grave that swallowed 1/3 of your people. But Herzl was also right. He envisioned a place where we determine our own destiny. And that's exactly what we're doing. He dreamed of a place where children would grow up Jewish and unafraid, a country that would absorb 800,000 refugees from the Muslim world and 1 million from the former USSR, no matter the cost, just because they were Jews who needed a place to go. Cultural Zionists won too. Half the world's Jews use the language of the Bible to order lattes and comment on TikTok and get into arguments with traffic cops. Our music combines East and West, ancient and modern, biblical and secular. Our comedians parody prime ministers and biblical kings. Revisionist Zionists created a language of pride and confidence that was meaningful to so many in the new state. They had predicted correctly that Jews in Israel would live on their swords. As I'm recording this, the IDF is fighting Hamas in Gaza and striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. And even though saying "I told you so" is one of life's greatest and pettiest pleasures, I don't think early revisionists would be happy that they were right on this point. As for the religious Zionists, well, the devout see God's hand everywhere. It's this faith that allows them to continue living full and joyous lives in a state that demands so much. The only party that truly lost were the non-Zionists. Some accepted that loss and tried to move forward. Ironically, a small but significant percentage of Israelis are non-Zionists. Even more ironically, they enjoy full citizenship and representation in the Israeli government, where they've carved out a niche advocating for their religious interests. As for the anti-Zionist protesters who believe the state of Israel should not exist, well, I'd encourage them to step into the 21st century, where we have SodaStream and camera pills and the microprocessors that are in every single PC. And also to step backwards to the 19th and early 20th centuries, to the time of violence and pogroms and strict immigration quotas. And I'd like to see them try and explain to those fleeing, desperate Jews where else they should have gone.
The only thing a Zionist has to say to them is, it must be really nice to live in a safe Western place where you can meditate on such things. And my job is to make sure my kids live. Your job is to decide whether it's moral or not for my kids to have survived.
So, do we need Zionism? Well, it's a complicated question. The state's founders had big, conflicting dreams about what a Zionist utopia should look like. All came true in some ways. None were fully realized. We still have competing visions for the future. We still argue and protest our government and write scathing op-eds. And we come together when it counts. We offer Jews around the globe the promise that our ancestors were denied. You will always have a home. And that's the point. That's the bedrock Zionism that unites all the Zionisms, from religious to secular, from socialist to revisionist. We have a home. We will not be homeless and vulnerable again. It's a messy home. We're still in the process of building it, of creating the kind of place we want and deserve to live. That is what I mean when I say that I'm a Zionist. Because I'm one of the millions of people doing the never-ending work of building a country worthy of 2,000 years of longing.